This is the first lecture for Wednesday, April 22nd. We're talking about the flow of materials through ecosystems, specifically talking about nutrients and elements being cycled within ecosystems. And we looked at water, we looked at carbon, and now we started looking at nitrogen the other day. And I pointed out these two things that I just want to not go into as much detail, but to remind you that will be important for understanding what happens with nitrogen as it moves through ecosystems. First are these different types of nitrogen, different forms of nitrogen. And here they are listed in red in this figure, that when nitrogen moves from one organism to another, from one part of the ecosystem to another, it changes forms. These are the different forms in which nitrogen occurs. The second thing is that the processes by which nitrogen is converted from one form to another are also variable within an ecosystem. There's different transformations that take place as nitrogen moves from one organism to the next, or one part of the ecosystem to another, and from one form to another. Now, those different transformations are listed here. So when nitrogen changes form from one form to another, as listed in that previous slide, then the process that's occurring are the 5 different types of nitrogen transformations here, part of the nitrogen cycle. So we'll look at each one of these, and during these different processes, we'll see these different forms of nitrogen. And this is all summarized in this figure up here in the gray with the red circles and rectangles and the ovals. So within this figure, there's a lot of information here, but it summarizes nitrogen transformations that occur in ecosystems pretty well. So we're going to look at what happens with nitrogen when it changes from one form to another, from one organism to another, and we'll look at the organisms involved and what it means in terms of this transformation that's taking place. So the first one is nitrogen fixation. This is accomplished by bacteria. There's a lot of nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the root nodules. There's a picture of root nodules that are full of these bacteria. But these are organisms that have this unusual capability, and that is to take nitrogen out of the air, out of the water, whatever, to take elemental nitrogen into. That's just pure nitrogen. And then incorporate it into their living parts of their cells. These are bacteria, so they're small, they're primitive, but they can incorporate nitrogen out of the environment into their cells. And that transformation is from elemental nitrogen, gaseous nitrogen, for instance, in the air, of which is a large proportion nitrogen, and then they attach some hydrogens and make ammonia. So this is an important step. This is getting nitrogen in some inorganic form, nitrogen just out there in the environment. Nitrogen is very important. Hopefully you remember that, all the different things that nitrogen occurs in, proteins and nucleic acids specifically. But who can take nitrogen out of the air? We can't do that. We need nitrogen. Rabbits need nitrogen. Bobcats and mountain lions need nitrogen. Everything needs nitrogen. But we have to get nitrogen from things that we eat. And then that nitrogen is eventually lost. And it's not in living things anymore. So this is a really important step, obviously, is getting nitrogen back into some living thing. And this is accomplished by bacteria in this process called nitrogen fixation. Now there's nitrification. where this ammonia, now that's not such a good source of nitrogen for things. Most organisms can't use ammonia. It's toxic to a lot of organisms, in fact, but plants can take up nitrogen, and they need nitrogen to grow and to increase in size, and the different process make whatever proteins they're making, and amino acids and DNA and RNA as well. But plants can't use nitrogen. Who can use nitrogen? Just these bacteria, but it's in the form of ammonia. Not very useful, this ammonia. However, if you take this nitrogen and the hydrogens in ammonia and you modify that, first in the form of nitrate and then in the form of nitrate, first in the form of nitrite and then nitrate, NO3. Now that is a form that can be used by plants. Ammonia, no. Gaseous nitrogen N2, no. NO3, yes. Nitrite, NO2, no. So there's these conversions that take place in terms of nitrification, which is basically making nitrogen available for plants, converting nitrogen from one form, ammonia, to another form, nitrite, to another form, nitrate, which is available for plants. Now plants can incorporate this into their tissues, and they have a form of nitrogen that they can use to make amino acids, they can use to make proteins, they can use to make ATP, they can use to make DNA and RNA. So this is another important step that's carried out by bacteria. Only bacteria are doing this. But now you notice that you've got a form of nitrogen that's not just, it's not unavailable to a whole bunch of different organisms. Now you've got nitrogen in plants. And all kinds of different things eat plants. And so you're beginning this step of nitrogen that's available to everybody, not just bacteria. Now you have this step of assimilation. So plant roots, they can absorb different forms of nitrogen. Ammonia is available to a certain degree, but it's not such an available form as nitrate. Nitrate can be assimilated and incorporated into the tissues of plants. So there's some ammonia. It depends on the plants, but it's not a big source. There's some ammonium that's available, but also not a big source. But this nitrate especially is a big source of nitrogen that's available for plants. And when they incorporate this into their tissues, into their DNA, RNA, proteins, amino acids, ATP, then that is assimilation. And these organic molecules now, these are things that have carbon in them. Now that's part of living things that other things can eat. We can eat plants, rabbits can eat plants, and attain a source of nitrogen that was previously unavailable. So this is an important property that plants have, getting nitrogen incorporated in their tissues that's essentially available for everybody else. And so you've got this organic nitrogen. Plants have this organic nitrogen, and it's eaten by animals. Animals have this, and now there's this organic nitrogen, and that has to be, well, these things die, or there's feces that are produced, there's wastes that are produced that contain a lot of organic nitrogen. And so this organic nitrogen, it's in different forms, uric acid, urea. It's broken down by decomposers, primarily bacteria, and converted to ammonia or ammonium, NH3 or NH4. Now that, as we saw, can be converted to nitrite, NO2, and nitrate, and go back into plants, be available for plants again. So this is an important recycling, not the loss of nitrogen to the air or to the water in form of just regular nitrogen by itself, but this is incorporation of organic nitrogen. It's conversion to a form that can go right back into plants as it's worked on by decomposers, including these bacteria. And now there's another step that takes place under anaerobic conditions where there's no oxygen. And instead of this nitrate being picked up by plants and incorporated into organic tissues and available for all these other organisms and cycled around and around, some of this nitrogen is lost. It's lost in the form of N2, or just nitrogen by itself. So it's not available. Then it's out in the atmosphere, it's in the air, or it's in the water. And only bacteria can incorporate that free nitrogen into their tissues, into their cells, into organic forms as ammonia. So this is the formation of that gas, nitrogen gas. Anaerobic conditions, so there's no oxygen, and it's carried out by bacteria, and the result is that you have the conversion of nitrogen to pure nitrogen, basically, N2. All that is two nitrogen. And so the whole thing starts over again. There's this nitrogen that's out there. It makes up a big part of the air. 80% of air is nitrogen, and that can be taken up again by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So this nitrogen, as you can see, it's more complicated than these other elements that we've looked at. All right, well, let's look at two other important elements, phosphorus and sulfur. Now, phosphorus, as you may remember, is important because phosphorus, in the form of phosphate anyway, is in every ATP, which is obviously important for energy transformations in living things. But this phosphorus is also in every DNA and RNA. So phosphorus is an important element. Sulfur is also important. So let's look at these two. Now, in terms of sulfur, first of all, sulfur is incorporated into geological formations. It's broken down in some cases by animals that can chemosynthesize. They can break bonds in chemicals and use that energy that's given off to make sugar. There's not very many organisms that can do that. There's bacteria, and there's not very many ecosystems where that happens. But it's a small source of carbon fixing. It's making sugars, not from light energy, but from chemical energy. So sulfur cycles between organisms. There's sulfur in a number of different forms. A number of different macromolecules contain sulfur. And then organisms die, they're decomposed, and the sulfur makes its way into the sediments. And then there's rainfall and there's water percolating through the sediments. Sulfur makes its way into water. And then there's sulfur that's acted upon primarily by bacteria. Sulfur makes its way into the atmosphere. You have gaseous sulfur. And then these can be incorporated by bacteria. They make their way into living things. So part of this sulfur is another example like carbon, where you see this element that, one, it's found in living things. Two, it's found in sediments or rocks. Three, it's found in the water. And four, it's found in the air. So this sulfur, as we saw with carbon, is a biogeochemical cycle, partly in biological things, partly in geological things. It's got different forms. And this cycling of sulfur between the air and water and organisms and sediments and back again can occur relatively quickly, but this can take hundreds or thousands of years for an individual sulfur to make its way through this cycle. All right, well, let's look at phosphorus as the last element to look at. If you look at phosphorus, I mentioned before, phosphorus is in every DNA, every RNA. Phosphorus is part of cell membranes, phospholipids, very important for cell membranes. And it's in ATP. It's also in living things. It's in bones, it's in teeth, it's a structural element. And phosphorus, as we saw with carbon and we just saw with sulfur, cycles between living things and non-living things. It's in organisms, and then it's in the earth, it's in soil, it's in sediments, it's in rocks, and then it's in water as well. There's not very much in the air, unlike carbon, in huge amounts in carbon dioxide, and sulfur, where there's a certain amount of sulfur in the atmosphere. And unlike some of these other cycles that we've seen, where bacteria, especially nitrogen, bacteria has a huge role. Bacteria is really important. Then bacteria for cycling phosphorus, not so important. Phosphorus is one of the things you find in fertilizer. There's nitrogen and there's phosphorus. And if you think about it, if somebody asked you why is nitrogen such an important part of fertilizer, then you could say, certainly have the information to say this based on what we've learned in this class. Well, nitrogen is important because it's important for growth, for plants, fertilizing, because nitrogen is found in every amino acid, every protein, every DNA, every RNA, every ATP. That's how important nitrogen is. So without nitrogen, plants aren't going to grow very quickly. It's an important fertilizer. You'd say the same thing with phosphorus. Why is phosphorus the other big component of fertilizer? Because it's found in every DNA, every RNA, cell membranes, ATP. It's a structural component of some plants as well. That's how important phosphorus is. So it's no wonder phosphorus is a limiting nutrient as well. It's not that soluble in water. There isn't that much in the air, so there's a lot of transfer of phosphorus between living things and the soil. It's an important nutrient in the soil. So plants can take up phosphate that includes phosphorus from the soil and incorporate it into their tissues, into organic compounds like DNA and RNA, their cell membranes. And then animals, and when these plants die, decomposers are working on the plants as well. Then there's a source of phosphorus for their own phosphorus or phosphate, whichever the case may be, for animals that are feeding on plants, for detritivores that are feeding on organic matter, for bacteria and fungi that are important decomposers. There's a source of phosphorus for all of those. So the phosphorus cycle isn't as complex as nitrogen. It's not as widespread in terms of huge amounts in water and air as carbon. And there's really two big sources of phosphorus where there's big stores of phosphorus in the phosphorus cycle. One is in living things and the other is in soil and sediments. So here's a rough summary of what you find in as far as phosphorus cycle. There's some phosphorus in the sediments, organic phosphorus that's broken down by weathering. And so this inorganic phosphate or phosphorus becomes available for it's incorporated into the soil, as well as phosphorus from living things that have died. And you have an organic input of phosphorus into the soil, and you have an inorganic input of phosphorus into the soil. So as a result of that, you've got soil that contains a certain amount of phosphorus from a couple of different sources, from living things that have died and from sediments that have been eroded. So now this inorganic phosphate and the organic phosphate in the soil is incorporated into plants. And you've got all these plants that have phosphorus that are eaten by animals that die, and as I said, are incorporated into the tissues of detritivores that are feeding on detritus, decomposers, bacteria, and then you've got some phosphate that makes its way into the ocean. There's only small concentrations of phosphate in water compared to other elements that's not so abundant, like sodium and chloride, and sulfur is a higher concentration in the ocean as well. And you'll notice in this figure, it's not even represented in the air. So there's three different parts. And again, this cycle of phosphorus can be pretty quick from a plant. Plant dies, it's decomposed, it's eaten by some detritivore, eaten by some animal, eaten by some other thing that's feeding on plants, and around it goes. Or it's incorporated into the sediments and modified, and it takes years to make its way through the sediments and back into living things. Here's another way of looking at phosphorus that quantifies the amount of phosphorus that you see in living things. And it also shows the different forms. You get a lot of phosphorus in plants, and then those plants are eaten by organisms. So if you look in the red part, or the brown part, this organic phosphorus that's part of living things, you have a lot in organisms, you have a lot in soil. Fertilizer, we add a lot of phosphorus. And then there's some that's in water, but you notice that the amounts in the water are not very large. If you look at the tiny little bit of phosphorus in the air, in the atmosphere, see how small those numbers are. So it's not a big part of the phosphorus cycle. If you look at the amount of phosphorus in sediments, now there's a lot of phosphorus. That's a huge amount of phosphorus, and it makes its way into the soil, broken down, and so the soil again is a combination of phosphorus from living things, organic matter that's being broken down, and a contribution from sediments as well. Okay, that's a good place to stop for this lecture. This is about 23 minutes. And we can finish this up with a relatively short lecture. We'll finish up talking about nutrient cycling, and that will be the end of the lectures for this Wednesday.